Good afternoon. Thanks so much for being with us, or good morning, good evening. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and I welcome you on behalf of the members of our leadership team, which aside from me includes former Congressman Mel Levine and former Los Angeles County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky. Welcome and many thanks to Suzanne Glasser for once again joining our program. And of course, welcome and thanks to today's moderator, the outstanding Madeleine Brand. Next Wednesday, March 26th, we'll hear from a very popular legal analyst. I just heard him on CNN a few minutes ago, and a former U.S. Attorney, Harry Littman. He is the senior legal columnist for The New Republic and a regular commentator on MSNBC and CNN. He's the creator and executive producer of the podcast Talking Feds, in which he brings together prominent figures from government, law, and journalism for interesting discussion about the most important topics of the day. He's a founding contributor to The Contrarian. He's overall a very interesting analyst and great to listen to. He'll be in conversation next week with Pat Morrison. The topic is, can our justice system weather this storm? We have an amazing April and May speaker lineup with Dennis Ross, Sarah Longwell, George Conway, John Michaels of UCLA Law, Larry Diamond with Michael McFaul about Russia and Ukraine, Brett Stevens, Doug Brinkley, the presidential historian, Andrew Weissman, David Axelrod, David Ignatius. We just have a great lineup, and we hope that you'll keep looking for our emails and signing up for programs as the registration links become available. But now, with no further ado, I will hand tonight's program over to the amazing award-winning NPR journalist, Madeleine Brand. We're so pleased to have you as a regular moderator on America to Crossroads. You're terrific. The program is all yours tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Janice. Thank you for having me back. And I'm really excited to speak with Susan for this hour. Brief introduction. Susan Glasser writes the weekly column Letter from Trump's Washington in The New Yorker, where she's a staff writer. She also hosts the magazine's Political Scene podcast, of which I am a dedicated listener. She's also served as editor of Politico, was founding editor of Politico Magazine, editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy Magazine, which won 3 national magazine awards during her tenure. She was the co-bureau chief in Moscow for the Washington Post and covered the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. She and her husband, New York Times correspondent Peter Baker, have written several books, including a best-selling history of the first Trump term, The Divider. Susan, welcome back to America at a Crossroads. Nice to have you back.
Oh, thanks. It's great to be with you again. Thank you.
Okay, so I struggle to come up with a roadmap for this conversation because I don't even know where to begin. There's so much. The fire hose of information is just extraordinary. There's the evisceration of federal agencies, the attack on trans people, the Orwellian prohibition on anything with any relation to DEI, including the Enola Gay, the canceling of scientific grants, the gutting of foreign aid, the embrace of Putin, the shaming of Zelensky, the tariffs on our closest allies, Mara Gaza, hawking of Teslas on the front lawn of the White House. I could just go on and on. So I guess I'm wondering, just from a kind of a procedural point of view, how do you focus? You've got to write this column every week. How do you focus on what is most important and what readers should know most?
You know, that's a pretty good list. I might need to nick that one from you. I mean, that's part of actually that was the original impetus for this column. Amazingly enough, I feel like regular time has been suspended in this kind of Trump era in our politics. But actually, when I started doing this column in 2018, it was in response to exactly that phenomenon of the feeling of overwhelmed and not remembering on a Thursday all the crazy things that had gotten you upset and worked up on a Monday or a Tuesday. And so that was the idea to, really take what are some through lines here? What are ways to navigate the chaos and the craziness? Now, here we are. Did I really think that I would be writing this all these years later? No. So there is the Groundhog Day problem, in addition to the what Steve Bannon called the fire hose of shit problem. And I think the Groundhog Day problem is both real, and yet what's amazing as we're having this conversation just barely 8 weeks into this second Trump term is how while there are echoes and rhymes and a familiarity, of course, to things, given that we have the same protagonist from Trump 1.0, that in the second term, I really think that what you're seeing is such an aggressive series of actions. And, it was still possible, if not plausible, throughout Trump's first term to dismiss him, at times as a blowhard, or that, it was a lot of rhetoric, only some of which came to pass. And, what you're seeing now is essentially the impossibility of sustaining that argument. We are looking at actions on a wide variety of fronts, such that there is no analogy, I don't believe, in American politics. And we usually caveat those things, I think, as journalists by saying, well, in modern presidential history, or in modern, I think it's fair to say there's really not an analogy in any history, because I don't think America has ever had a president who came to office so determined, essentially, to blow up many of the foundations of our government itself.
And I suppose what is also extraordinary is he's not alone. So he has built up this apparatus, including Congress at this moment, to enable him to do that, which, yeah, in the first Trump administration, he had all these firewalls, as you really definitely pointed out in your first book, on the Trump administration, I don't know if there's going to be a second one. I assume there will be a second one, but that he had all these roadblocks of people and of procedures and of norms and of just not knowing what he was doing. But over the past 4 years has built up this enormous apparatus that is now operating with lightning speed. And I'm wondering, because I feel taken aback by that. I didn't realize he would have this entire ecosystem around him to do all this so quickly. And I'm just wondering, as someone who follows this very closely and lives in Washington and has reported on this for many years, if you saw that coming as well.
Look, I'm always mindful of our experience in Russia. And, there was an old Soviet saying from the Stalinist times, actually, that cadres decide everything. And so who you have around you in government tells you about your ability to push through your agenda, whether it's radical or not. And in the first Trump term, as you pointed out, I think the story that we told in The Divider, was a story of Trump facing constraints both within his own administration and from his party. It was a still not fully complete takeover of the Republican Party that we were watching. And so a lot of the most consequential fights in many ways were kind of rear guard actions, mopping up operations at times with the Republican Party. And that included officials inside his own government, as well as, those lone voices of dissent on Capitol Hill who have become so rare now as to be vanishingly hard to find. And so that was a lot of the drama of Trump 1.0. Flash forward, and there was a very concerted effort on the right. Donald Trump is not, it's important to underscore that, he is not himself a creature of the ideological modern American right. That's not where he comes from. It's not why he came into politics. It's not who his natural people are. However, he has fused with those people. And I would point you to actually quite a remarkable interview that my old colleague from Politico Magazine did the other day, Michael Hirsch, with the guy who was the purged creator of Heritage Foundation's Project 2025. He's the guy who pulled that whole project together and then was fired. I don't know if you remember when Trump was sort of lying to the public during the 2024 campaign and saying, oh no, that has nothing to do with us. That's not our agenda at all. Like, how outrageous. And so they fired this guy as sort of a, sacrificial, proof, quote unquote, that they weren't really setting the agenda for the second Trump term. He gave this interview just a couple days ago in which he says, well, of course they're enacting Project 2025. In fact, it's, quote, succeeded beyond my wildest dreams in such a short period of time. But what's notable is that, again, that represents a kind of an ideological Bible, a wish list, if you will, of the American conservative project to tear down the federal government, which is, decades in the making. Again, Trump has sort of merged with this, but he is not this. So then there are also other camps that exist. There's the kind of hardcore Trump personal loyalists. There's the tech bro converts to the right wing. There are, of course, the Christian evangelical voters who make up the huge core of the Republican Party's voting base. And without them, Donald Trump never would have had one term, never mind two, even though, of course, he himself is the farthest thing one could imagine from being a personal subscriber to their ideology. So I wanted to lay that out and make that point, because when you look at why is he able to do this, because there are cadres of Republicans who've been waiting years, if not decades, to enact this agenda. Number one. So they are now in government. Number two, Trump is burned. And the most important thing to him in appointing this new leadership of the government was personal loyalty to him. And that there would be no dissent brooked, like the way John Kelly or Jim Mattis or Rex Tillerson in the first term disagreed and even stymied many of his plans. That's number two, loyalty, personal loyalty. And then number three is a willingness to defy the law that definitely is emboldened by a Trump who's determined to get revenge and retribution after what he feels are the wrongs done to him. And so his own, I think, radicalization is also the third factor that I would identify here.
And so do you see him as a changed man from the first term in terms of this kind of bitter obsession with retribution? He always seemed to have that strain in him, but now he's obviously letting it flow. You see what he's doing with the law firms, for example. He's punishing the law firms who worked for Democrats or who helped Jack Smith pro bono in some of his cases against Trump. And so just as a man and his personality, as you observe him, how has he changed since when you first wrote the book, The Divider?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think you're exactly right that, Donald Trump is still Donald Trump. Remember, he is like a very, set in his ways, 78-year-old guy. He's really not processing a lot of new information. I used to call it the bad boyfriend theory, right? It's like, he's not going to change people. So he is who he is, and he's always had, an exaggerated sense of grievance. He remembers every wrong ever done to him. He's still mad he didn't win that Emmy, 20 years ago. So he's the same guy. Many of his preoccupations are still his preoccupations, whether it's taking over Greenland, which, by the way, we found out in doing the book, The Divider, actually had been a preoccupation for him. It only became public for a brief kind of moment, and people kind of laughed at it in the summer of 2019. But what we found out in doing the reporting after Trump left office was that none of us had known about this, but he had actually been pestering his cabinet secretaries and talking about it for years leading up to when he mentioned it in public. He had even tried to press some of his cabinet secretaries saying, why don't we trade Puerto Rico for Greenland in his first term? It just never became public. So many of the themes are still Donald Trump's themes. What's different, and certainly the desire for vengeance, the obsession with enemies and retribution against them, no matter how petty that retribution might be. But I would say when he first came into office 8 years ago, he still cared in many ways about receiving the respect that he felt was owed to him, by more conventional establishment. He was still sort of the insecure outsider from Queens who wanted the people in Manhattan to give him his due deference. And that was definitely, I think, how he approached Washington. He was waiting for Washington to bow down before him. He was very, very angry when it did not, fully do so. But also, I think he felt there was an asterisk, frankly, hanging over his presidency, both because Hillary Clinton had defeated him in the popular vote and because of the questions around the Russian interference in the election, which he felt cast a pall over the legitimacy of his presidency. This time, right, he claims an overwhelming mandate, the biggest mandate in the history of the world, which, fact check, it's not, but it was a bigger win. He defeated Kamala Harris by more, in a significantly meaningful way, more votes then he defeated Hillary Clinton. He won the popular vote, although just under 50% of the vote. So he didn't win a majority. And he's much more about actually not seeking approval anymore. And that scares me, frankly. And I do think that that's part of what's going on right now is that it's more about the exercise of power, the embrace of the most radical possible both ideas and people who are willing to carry out those ideas.
He's hinted and said off the cuff and maybe not so off the cuff that maybe he'll stick around and seek a third term. Do you think he'll do that?
Well, that is amazing that here we are only 8 weeks in, and this is a conversation that not only are we having, but that he and his supporters are already actively promoting and putting out there. I think Steve Bannon just referenced it in an interview just again yesterday. And why are they doing that? Well, you could say it's because they love to own the libs. They like to make us crazy and have us like get into fits speculating about this. I'm sure that's part of the appeal. Because it goes without saying that, it's blatantly unconstitutional. And in fact, there's no wiggle room in that. But I also think there's something else to it. Being a lame duck would just make Donald Trump crazy. And by constantly speculating about a third term, people spend more time talking about that than they do about the fact that he, isn't going to face the voters again and that life moves on. That's going to make him crazy. But then, so what's the chance? What's the percentage chance, that he seeks to do this, that he finds a lawyer a la John Eastman to advance some crazy outlandish theme? Maybe he says, well, I never really got to serve my full first term in office because of the Russia hoax and the illegitimate impeachment of me or something. I don't know. But I would take
He's
them.
trying to get rid of birthright citizenship. So no one would think that would be taken seriously, but it might get to the Supreme Court.
Right. Exactly.
Speaking of judges, I want you to weigh in on what's been going on this week with the judge in the Venezuelan deportation case and Trump basically saying, not basically, he did say that he should be impeached, and the pushback from Chief Justice John Roberts. And everyone has been wringing their hands before this and wondering, are we in a constitutional crisis? What will it be? What will it take? Do you think we are here now?
Look, I have a different view of this maybe than some other people, which is that, we're already in a constitutional crisis, and these are just different manifestations of it that we're seeing. And the reason that I say that is because the country has as president right now the only president in American history who has refused to accept the constitutional lawful results of an election. And that means that he's a president willing to exist outside of the Constitution or even in defiance of it. Directly challenging the rule of law is also something that is in, the checklist of the authoritarian playbook. And right now, it looks from where we're sitting as though, Trump and his allies are pretty much running through that checklist, going after the independent media, going after universities, going after institutions in our society that could possibly stand as independent checks on his authority. And of course, the biggest possible independent check on his authority is the judiciary, especially now that the Republicans control both houses of Congress and have made it clear they are completely supine. They are not playing the role envisioned for them by the founders of the Constitution. So I think it was almost inevitable that this kind of conflict would occur. Also, Donald Trump, if you go back to the very beginning of his time as a political figure, do you remember when he started attacking a judge by name in the late spring of 2016 when he was becoming the Republican Party's nominee? And he started going after a judge in one of the many, many cases filed against him by name and saying, well, he's Mexican, and therefore, he can't be trusted with my case to be independent. And so the big difference, again, Madeleine, if I look at Trump 1.0 and Trump 2.0, is that the silence surrounding his most outrageous actions. The opposition to Donald Trump from within his own party, even at times, and we can talk about it for many Democrats, has gone dark. And, I was just looking at this because I was thinking of writing my column tomorrow, at least in part about this. And here, I'll give you a couple of quotes from Republican senators who found it disgusting and appalling that Donald Trump would go after a judge in 2016. Marco Rubio said, "It's wrong. I hope he stops." Republican Senator Susan Collins called Trump's comments absolutely unacceptable. And on it went at that time. Have you heard a word from Susan Collins this week? Oh, and what about Senator Marco Rubio, now Secretary Marco Rubio? No, of course you haven't heard anything from him. And I think that that's so important. It's not new that Donald Trump undermines the rule of law by attacking judges. What's new is that he has an instant mob that's willing to follow him down the road to places that we just haven't been before as a democracy.
Yeah, you had Rubio retweeting the president of El Salvador's oopsie tweet, which was basically thumbing its nose at the judge, saying, "Too bad, the planes can't turn around. Oh, well, oopsie."
Yeah.
And Rubio retweeting that, thereby endorsing it. I guess I'm wondering where this ends up, because the administration did actually go to court to answer some of the judge's questions and then didn't answer some of the judge's questions. And I guess that has been postponed until tomorrow, yet another hearing. But could it get to a point where they don't even bother showing up in court and just do whatever they want and pay no attention to the judiciary? And then what?
Well, it's very interesting. I mean, I think just talking about the politics, we're not legal analysts, we're not lawyers here, but I think it's part of the challenge is that it's leapt out of the realm of law. It's leapt out of the courtroom, and it's part of a political war on our institutions, and a kind of war that our judiciary is actually not very well equipped to fight, even if it so chooses. For example, the Rorschach test of the Trump years. Do you find it an example of, strong, important pushback from Chief Justice John Roberts that he put out a statement yesterday in the wake of the attacks on Judge Boasberg by Trump and the others? Or do you find the statement weak? Or do you say, as I sort of say, okay, well, I'm not sure what that statement means. I don't think anyone's listening to it. Justice Roberts went along with the immunity decision last year issued by the Supreme Court, which you could argue as much as anything else helped to pave the way, not only for Trump to win re-election to a second term, but to essentially give preemptive cover to Trump's sweeping actions to usurp the rule of law and the functions of the other branches of government. Without that immunity decision, I think we'd be in a different place as a country. So how do I balance Justice Roberts going along with that immunity decision versus, a meaningless, statement of support for a judge whose rule of law he arguably has done as much or more to undercut than any Chief Justice of our lifetime? So it's a painful moment. And by the way, that's the thing about an authoritarian challenge to our system, right? Justice Roberts obviously is a believer in the rule of law. He has an incredible, delicate challenge now to do what's right in all these test cases that are coming before him, while at the same time not seeing the basic authority of his court eroded so much that it doesn't matter what they rule. And I frankly think that's as tough of a challenge as we've ever seen, a justice having to calibrate, because it is a strategy. by Trump. It is a strategy. Does he expect to win all of these cases? My guess would be not. The birthright citizenship that you mentioned is one of them. But these cases serve many functions for him, even if he anticipates losing, even if he does lose some of them. Some of it is messaging, showing his fervent base that he's, taking the maximal approach to stopping immigration in this country, even if he himself is checked with some of those measures. But it's the scale and scope of it, Madeleine. And I think that it's a breathtaking assertion of executive power so sweeping that if you take that along with the immunity decision, I mean, again, I'm not a constitutional scholar, but Trump is now asserting powers of one man rule that just seem antithetical to why we were even created as a country. And, frankly, it's kind of terrifying to be sitting here, and I don't see Americans reacting as though that's what's happening. And yet that is what's happening. And, my cousin, I wrote about this a few weeks ago, my cousin who lives out there in Los Angeles, who's a wonderful lawyer, sent me an email after one of these. I think it was actually when Trump fired the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. By the way, an outrage that doesn't even make anybody's list anymore.
Right.
And that's a nonpartisan job. And she said, how come there's nobody in the streets? In France, they'd have taken over every government building by now. And those words really haunt me. And
In Serbia, they're taking over government buildings right now.
Americans have been supine. And what's amazing is that not even half the country voted for this guy. So where the heck is the other half of this country? I don't know. I'm not a political strategist. I'm not a constitutional lawyer. I can't advise anybody. I don't know what the right thing to do is, but I can tell you that history is very clear that allowing someone to not even be opposed while taking actions like this only 8 weeks into their term is going to lead to somewhere even more extreme and radical.
So that brings us to Chuck Schumer. And he is experiencing a blowback that I'm sure even he did not anticipate. He had to cancel his book tour, or at least postpone it, because people are so furious. He's got people outside his home in Brooklyn protesting. He's got all of the House Democrats pretty much furious with him. So just to recap, he allowed the Republican budget bill to go through, even though it has some pretty broad cuts and gives more powers to Trump and to DOJ. So I guess I'm wondering, what is his political future? People are now talking about AOC primarying him, or maybe he should step down from his leadership post. Do you think he survives this, or is this an inflection point for him and for Democrats in general?
Well, it's definitely an inflection point. I think we can say that pretty clearly. And, I thought I was pretty shocked except that it's Democrats, so I wasn't really shocked, that after the election, they would, spend an inordinate amount of time, on the kind of inward looking recriminations. But, I have to say, 8 weeks into it, I genuinely am amazed that these people have not been able to get their act together in the face of threats unlike anything we have seen. First of all, it makes them all look like incredible hypocrites, Madeleine. You can't go and tell the American people, oh my God, Donald Trump is so terrible. He is going to be a fascist if we let him back into the White House. And then what are you doing? A week later, Joe Biden, come sit by my crackling fire. Welcome. We hope we're doing everything possible that we can for you, sir. Okay. It makes them look like incredible hypocrites who only care about their narrowly defined political self-interest. When you get, again, I recognize they're in a political bind here. It's easy for us, we're critics from the cheap seats. That's the nature of journalism. But, you have this, real uproar that I think is the context for the Schumer dilemma that he's facing right now. Jim Carville writes an op-ed in the New York Times. He says, not only should Democrats not be doing more right now, but they should literally roll over and play dead. That being an exact quote for his strategic advice to Democrats right now. And, I recognize I have a different perspective on this, but I covered Russia for the first 4 years of Putin's time in office, which was exactly the period of time in which Putin was consolidating power, coming into power, and eliminating in a pretty systematic way, the very flawed but nascent pillars of Russian democracy. What did he do? He went after the independent media, the only independent television network in Russia's history. That was the very first thing that happened when I arrived in Russia. He co-opted oligarchs or sent them into exile or jail. He took over and renationalized, the state's largest, most successful westernized company and jailed the richest man in Russia who dared to oppose him politically. He, canceled the democratic election of governors and turned those into presidential appointments. He took over the Russian Duma, which had been quite active in the 1990s, and turned it into a pocket parliament. And, go down the list. So that's my perspective. Again, it's a different perspective. Thank goodness we're not Russia. We have a different history, institutions, federalism, strong states, but the but is pretty important here too. And that is that, we're so focused on our two-party system, we often conflate the interests of Democrats, the political party, and civil society and Americans, the country. And I think that's what's happening right now. And Chuck Schumer looked like he was conducting business as usual in a non-business as usual period of time. So it doesn't look like anyone's throwing him out of that position anytime in the next couple of weeks. Who knows? But I do think that, his time is rapidly passing.
Mm. Yeah, well, I'm a little sympathetic to his argument that he pointed out that if you let the government shut down, that's exactly what they want. And would they ever open it up again? And they could do so much damage that we can't even imagine with the government shut down. So there is that side of the argument. But in terms of the larger kind of existential questions of where the Democrats are, who is taking up the mantle? Who is actually saying, this is who we should be, this is where we are, and I'm going to lead you there?
Yeah, just a couple on the Senate, because I think you're right, and I understand, and in a sort of rational Washington as we've lived through it in recent years, that is an argument that makes sense. And again, by the way, he and James Carville, they know their business. They're not necessarily wrong that Democrats may benefit in the midterm elections from this series of radical, extreme, and, many of them probably unlawful attacks on the federal government. One imagines that is very likely to offer political benefits to Democrats as they try to take back at least the House in 2026. So as a matter of narrow politics, you could see that there's merit in that argument. But again, that's if you conflate the interests of the Democratic Party, capital D, with the interests of civil society here in this country. And by the way, around the world, you can't unilaterally shutting down all American foreign aid. That's not really a budget cutting measure. There are very few savings to the federal budget to be gleaned from that, less than 1% of the budget. That's about inflicting harm that can't be undone just because some Democrats might win an election in competitive seats in a midterm race nearly 2 years from now. So that's number one. To your question about who's going to lead, I mean, look, Democrats are going to have a robust thing we're already seeing every day, stories and speculation about, will AOC, run for this or that and the other thing. Pete Buttigieg decided not to run for an open Senate seat in Michigan in the midterms in order to be positioned for another presidential campaign in the following cycle. There's a draft Rahm Emanuel thing where JB Pritzker seems like he's already, out there on the hustings. There's your governor in California doing whatever he's doing with his podcast. So there's going to be a robust field of people, but that's why I use the term civil society. You can't wait for a savior. I mean, that's part of the crisis here is this idea that Trump has really fostered this notion, I'm the only one who matters, this sort of personalist vision of power that's so at odds with, the concept of an American democracy that was all about civil society and not about, one all-powerful leader telling us what to do or to lead us out of the wilderness. And so, I think if Democrats are waiting for someone to come and save them, they're probably not going to find that.
So I guess I am going to ask you what your thoughts are on why there was so much vociferous protesting in the first Trump administration and the pink hats and all that. Why do you think Americans are just kind of like, maybe they're furious, people who are not Trump supporters, but they're not out on the streets protesting en masse? Was it something that perhaps will happen, or is it a shift of exhaustion, of feeling powerless, of I don't know what?
Yeah, I mean, all of the above, Madeline.
Yeah.
I do think that it's quite likely that ultimately there will be people in the street. And I should say, as you pointed out with the government shutdown, they're part of what is probably holding many of Trump's critics back is a recognition that on some level they want to provoke a confrontation. And I think this is not just an idle fear. It is well documented. Donald Trump spent the summer of 2020 talking about how he wanted to invoke the Insurrection Act and put uniformed military on the streets of America's cities to put down, protests, even those that were not violent. And so there may be a sense that he and his movement want violence in order to consecrate it. That is the story, unfortunately, of the, sort of despotic regimes in history, is that in fact they seek out violent clashes in order to further consolidate their power in a society, in order to justify extreme measures that they might not be able to justify otherwise. So I think this is a well-grounded and historical fear that is part of the reservation of people getting out there on the streets. And we don't have the same traditions of, protests that the French do, for example, citing my cousin's email. No question about that. So I don't mean to diminish in any way. Those are very legitimate concerns and qualms. However, the level of quiescence and fear and acceptance is really shocking. And I hope that it causes people at a minimum to really reevaluate, their own definition of, American exceptionalism. The idea, that remember that Trump and Elon Musk and his Doge, team of 20 people, they are a minority of a minority who have essentially taken over the levers of government, with no more than bleats of protest. I noticed, somebody pointing out, a liberal pointing this out with increasing agitation over the last week. What happened to all those students who cared so much about the terrible things that are happening in Israel and Gaza last year, and they don't care about their own country? Why aren't they protesting this? I mean, that is actually something I think that you're going to hear more of that. And I understand why. I actually kind of find that shocking. This is their country, and they don't seem to be caring about their country.
This talk was supposed to be about Trump's cabinet. We haven't But they have been pretty quiet with the exception of a couple of them, Rubio. Kash Patel, for example, what has he been up to? I know he's waiting in the wings to perhaps, as you say, help Trump enforce the Insurrection Act or go after his enemies, but he has been relatively quiet. What are you hearing about what's happening at the FBI?
Well, honestly, this is where I really am, again, quite concerned because of how quickly this is all gone. We're only 8 weeks into it. So, and Patel was not confirmed, from the get-go. So he's literally only weeks into the tenure, and he's already undertaken, it didn't get that much attention, of course, because we're focused on other things, a very sweeping, major reorganization of the FBI, and absolutely changed the structure of the place, presumably installed loyalists or people he perceives who are willing to carry out his agenda. So he's essentially consolidating power still inside the Bureau. The other major thing that happened, which again would have been like shocking front page scandal, ongoing big news, is, installed as his deputy, as his number two at the FBI, rather than a career official who normally would have that, a podcaster whose major qualification for the office is personal loyalty to Donald Trump in a very brief tenure many, many years ago, in law enforcement, but nowhere near, anything that would qualify him to serve as the deputy FBI director. And again, taking two of the most partisan people you could possibly imagine and putting them in these offices of enormous, what's supposed to be nonpartisan power in our society. So that's what worries me, because this is all happening with largely kind of Musk and, a handful of tech bros, big balls and the others. And, when the rest of the government actually has consolidated power around Trump political appointees, then you're going to hear a next phase. So for right now, at the Defense Department, for example, lots of theatrics around, the kind of performative culture wars that Pete Hegseth, Fox News host turned defense secretary, is bringing to the place, purging websites of, you mentioned the Enola Gay, I guess because the word gay is now banned. There was the one that came out just in the last 24 hours of Jackie Robinson. I mean, American icon, American hero, having him taken down. The flag bearers from Iwo Jima, websites to them taken down. But when you get past that kind of performative BS that, Musk's AI algorithm can, produce, then you're going to really see what are they doing with the power once they've consolidated it. And, that's a whole next wave that I think people haven't braced for. I am amazed at the lack of a serious playbook by the opposition here beyond, okay, we'll just sue and we'll take everything to court. Okay, but I think we've reached the limits of people's imagination for just how radical the change could be. And, at least my imagination in some cases is already exhausted. And so I'm quite worried about what could come next. Because I dreamed, I thought it was very possible actually that they would kick out the independent press pool from the White House and turn that into a kind of a Kremlin press pool, of only loyal media. I thought they would do that maybe by the end of Trump's first year. Well, they did that in his first few weeks in office. So, we have a long way to go.
Are you personally worried, or are you and your husband worried because Kash Patel has gotten named journalists that he wants to go after?
I mean, I don't even know. I know people do ask us that. This is why we do what we do. The thing that's so sad about it, of course, is that it's a lot easier to cover this kind of assault on democracy as a foreign correspondent than it is to do it in your own country. And, I know so many brave journalists in all of these societies, and people, many people who can't even live in their societies anymore, who are exiled. One of our closest friends, from Moscow, we just saw the other day, can't go home, can't be with their elderly parents. I remember Turkish journalists, who I've met over the years who can't return to their country. So, it's incredible that to even be asked that question in
I know. I'm sorry to ask it, but I am
Oh,
wondering.
it's okay. It's no, not you.
Yeah. But do you think it could get to that where you actually feel unsafe doing your job?
I mean, look, all the people in public life now, not just journalists, but, political figures, so many people. This is a negative, ugly time in our politics just generally. And, unfortunately, look at the cesspool that our public space has become. The things that people say to any kind of a public figure, whether journalist or not, are revolting and often threatening and dangerous. And I don't know, as a society, we've shrugged our collective shoulders at it for too long, So, January 6th for me was a reminder, that we, may think, oh, well, nobody takes Donald Trump seriously, whatever. Okay, well, those people did. Those people did. And so I haven't ruled anything out since that day.
Okay, let me get to some of these questions. There's so many great questions. Jan, Marcia, and a few others are asking, do you think Trump is working with Putin with the goal of dividing the world among Putin, Xi, and Trump, at least Putin and Trump? Do you think Trump is a Russian asset?
Well, these are great questions. I should say the next book that that Peter and I are working on is going to be a book that sort of looks at the kind of disaster of the last 25 years of Washington and Russia since Putin came to power. So it's Putin and the 5 US presidents who've struggled and obviously failed to deal with him. And that's been a theme I've struck again and again tonight, from being a young journalist and, covering did the United States successfully export democracy to Russia, to here we are a quarter century later wondering what is it exactly that Russia might be exporting to the United States. It's a kind of a tragic story. Obviously, no one, in my view, has ever fully offered a compelling single explanation for Trump's affinity with Vladimir Putin. He clearly has a broad affinity for dictators and strongmen and admiration for them. Those are the people he reliably praises, whom he reliably says he has a great relationship, not just with Putin, but Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un and Erdogan and Turkey. And so, there is a broad affinity with dictators as well as a specific affinity and admiration with Putin. In many cases, what's striking is that when it comes to Russia and Putin, Trump is a leading indicator here. He is not following the will of his voters. In fact, it's remarkable, even in the last few weeks, as he has made almost a single-handed pivot in our geopolitical strategy away from the allies in Europe who've been our allies since, World War II and even before. The American public, even Republicans, don't really support this. They don't support Putin or Russia in its war with Ukraine, even now. I mean, there are many Americans who don't necessarily want to continue to give billions and millions of dollars in assistance to Ukraine, but there's almost no Americans, except for some of Trump's most vocal supporters, who seem to actually be on Russia's side in the war. And so that's interesting to me because Trump actually very rarely wants to defy his base. When he takes political positions that are against them, he backs away. Like, for example, the COVID vaccine, which he was a big booster of. And then they booed him at a rally, in 2021 when he was bragging about it. And since then, you don't hear him talking about that booster. That's more typical Trump behavior. So for him to stake any political credibility on Putin, again, always been an outlier. There are others who explain his, interest in Russia as being that of a businessman who always fantasized about building a Trump Tower in Moscow, who always saw that as the big deal that he could never make, that it might be about money in some other way. One of his sons was quoted before Trump entered public life as saying that they were dependent on Russian money to rescue them at a time when their business was otherwise in trouble. So, there's lots of explanations, possible explanations for it, but the main thing is it's a fundamental repudiation, I would say, of core foreign policy and geopolitical beliefs of Democrats as well as Republicans. And that goes to the other part of the question. What's he trying to do? He's rolled out a kind of a 19th century imperialist vision of the world in which it is almost a playground for predatory great powers, and that what his real aspiration almost seems to be to carve it up with Putin and Xi, and that, each of them would have essentially their sphere of influence and be able to operate with impunity within it, whether that means going after neighbors like Canada and Mexico, or, annexing Greenland, or taking back the Panama Canal. And so, how far will he go to act on those things? Not yet clear, but it's a radical vision, and in many ways, again, it's not just rhetoric. I would underscore that. What he's doing in repudiating our European alliance is making actually some concrete decisions that will be not easily undone. And you won't just get a do-over, even if Republicans are voted out of office in 4 years.
And repudiating our alliances with our closest allies, Canada, and to a lesser extent, I guess at this point, Mexico. The Canada thing is baffling. I think it's baffling to even his greatest admirers on Fox. What is he doing with Canada? Why Canada? Any idea?
No, and by the way, again, like, it's just another one of those questions. If you like pause for a minute just to sort of say, like, can you believe we're talking about this?
Yeah.
Canada is our best friend. It's not just like, okay, a fine, like, it's our best friend. We are so lucky by our geographic position in the world and by having such a great neighbor. And, to your point about even his supporters, I think, are baffled by this. I ran into a lobbyist the other day from Alabama, as deep red of a state as it comes, for a power company in Alabama, presumably as deep red of a, constituency as one could imagine. And I was asking this lobbyist, well, what's the reaction down there in Trump country? And, I said, do they want to, take over Canada and what? She said, no. She said she has people coming up to her all the time saying, like, Canada, like, what's the matter with Canada? Why can't we, And no one understands it. No one understands it. But that's the difference in having a rule of law system or having a personalist system, right? The whims of the dear leader, whether they are taking over the board of the Kennedy Center and wanting to redecorate it and have more Broadway shows like Cats.
That was one of his favorites.
Yeah, no, I mean, actually, that was amazing scoop by the New York Times. If you haven't seen it, they actually obtained a recording of this Kennedy Center board meeting that Trump went to earlier this week, in which he went on at great length about what a great show Cats was and how they should have more stuff like that. And, you can laugh at it, but in a way, I would put the Canada thing as a reminder that the risk to the country is governance by whim of a leader. That is the system that we're not supposed to have. And some of it might just be stupid, like, I order you to take down, the portraits of my predecessors. And then some of it is leading to really, really damaging consequences.
So I'm wondering, let me just ask this question and then amplify it with my question. What do you say about the Republican town halls at which people, ostensibly Republicans, are expressing outrage? Will these protesters make an impact? Do the Republican leaders care about that? Won't it impact the midterms? And I guess to amplify that, I'm wondering if people are just waiting for this to play out. They're hoping that there will be a big revolt in 2026 and things will go back to relatively normal because there will be at least some opposition in Congress in power.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. That is part of the theory of the case. As far as the town halls go, I mean, one response that you've already seen from Republicans is to tell their members, don't have town halls. They're shouting at you, then don't give them the opportunity to do so. And one of the analogies that was kicked around a little bit when this first started happening was, well, remember how the Tea Party rebellion against Barack Obama took hold in this way, and maybe there'll be a kind of a left-wing Democratic version of that. Okay, well, maybe. As far as whether winning back the House of Representatives in 2026 would be a check on Trump's authority, I guess I would point out that one thing that the first Trump term kind of showed us pretty conclusively was that the power that the House has, especially if it's only just by itself, it's not the House and the Senate, is pretty minimal when it comes to a president who's determined to defy them. And the only remedy envisioned in the Constitution for conflicts between the two is impeachment. And frankly, Donald Trump has shown that impeachment is a dead letter. And it's hard after he's survived not one but two impeachments to think that there could be any meaningful check on him from the threat of impeachment. So if the House doesn't even wield that weapon anymore, then I'm not sure what to say. Trump is very adept at running out the clock on things like investigations and subpoenas and being found in contempt. And, at most they'd have just 2 years left in the Trump presidency to wield those powers anyways. So, again, that's why I keep saying if your strategy is to roll over and play dead and win back the House in 2026, to what end?
No. Oh. Ruth says, do you think that the economic problems he's creating and a recession could be his undoing? You had the Fed today not cutting interest rates, saying that it doesn't look good. The economy doesn't look good.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is where maybe I, come back to a more conventional political analysis. And yes, I think that, the economy really is the foundation for any American president. And, if you send the country into a recession, especially one that would be pretty clearly of his own making with these policies, you could really imagine that being a political disaster for Trump and for his supporters in elected offices. And, that seems to be a real risk. I mean, he's kind of playing chicken with the global economy right now. On April 2nd, he's not only threatened these tariffs, he's now threatening essentially tariffs, as I understand it, on basically everything that we buy now. He's escalated his threats to be much more sweeping than they were before.
Well, so if he doesn't care about his bases, or he does care about his base's opinions, that would seem to fly in face of that because his base would be most directly affected.
You would think so. You would think so. But it's also true that, we started this conversation with the fact that Trump is a lame duck. Maybe he doesn't care. The other thing is, again, we talked about the possibility of street protests, provoking a confrontation, possibly being in Trump's interests. Well, again, in a crisis, the opportunity also exists to remake the system and to make radical changes far more quickly than you could otherwise, to pull onto yourself emergency powers and to reshape things. And by the way, that's part of how Russia has survived the war and the sanctions that were supposedly going to be crippling on their economy. In part, they've hurt their economy, but they have also provided Vladimir Putin with a tool for the much more rapid remilitarization of the Russian economy than he might have been able to get away with otherwise. They literally have turned shopping malls in Russia into bomb factories, okay? And, militarized the economy, made it much more dependent on the power of the state than it was before the war. And that's part of the reasons why they're still fighting on and still hanging on. And, crises are opportunities for people who wish to seize power.
There are these huge demonstrations planned for April 5th, nationwide at the Capitol. Do you think that's when we'll see what you're talking about?
I think having a crystal ball is really hard.
Yeah.
It's
something
just
you're worried about, thinking about those demonstrations in
yeah,
particular.
I was right. So you're worried on the one hand about violence and what, Trump would do to generate it. On the other hand, in all these societies also, where you've seen authoritarian takeovers or partial dismantling or the creation of the quote unquote illiberal democracies in Hungary, it's not just one-off protests, right? You actually have people in the streets every day, again and again and again. That's what we've seen in Europe. You mentioned Serbia at the beginning. We've seen that in Hungary, where there's even to this day tens of thousands of people routinely taking to the streets. In the poor country of Georgia, you have seen thousands and thousands of people out there in the streets trying to stop essentially the dismantling of their democracy. It hasn't succeeded, but it's that kind of rising up of the society that's not just one-off protests.
Okay, we'll end it there with a call to arms. And Susan, it's always a pleasure to hear your analysis, so cogent, intelligent, and just amazing analysis of what's happening. And thank you for that. I appreciate it. It's pretty grim, but I think we all need to face what's happening.
Well, I want to thank you for these great questions and thank everybody for spending the time, to think about it tonight and to tune in. I know there's, a lot of reasons not to do that, so I'm really grateful. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. Hope to see you soon and looking forward to your next book. And check your email for the next great panel discussion that we're offering. I think next week we have Harry Littman with Pat Morrison. So look forward to that, and I'll see you soon.